Hello, my name is Odessa Burkett, and the controversy I'm focusing on is for-profit higher education, which I think is an important sector to understand. Let's begin with a look at the different types of higher education and a brief history of for-profits and student debt in the U.S. There are four primary types of higher education in the United States today. There are public, state-funded schools, private nonprofit schools funded by donors and endowments, like Northeastern, and then private for-profit schools, which we'll focus on today, whose goal is to profit, and finally community colleges, which are usually local two-year colleges. Next, let's take a look at the for-profit sector. As we can see, the sector has been growing since the 80s and significantly in the 21st century. The rise in for-profit institutions occurred both because of a need for more educational institutions and because it was a fruitful business opportunity. In the 21st century, schools began to be run by large national corporations with decentralized models rather than smaller local vocational schools. This allowed schools to reach more people and in turn make more money. Also during this time, more people started to seek higher education, as more and more degrees became a necessity for skilled work. Student debt has also been on the rise in the 21st century, with debt peaking at $1.4 trillion this year, with the default rate at 11.5%, slightly up from last year. For-profit schools are a significant source of these defaults, with 35% of all defaults in 2016 and only 11% of students. To understand how this could be, let's take a deeper look at the for-profit education structure. First, let's take a look at the key players involved. The federal government is the most significant source of funding for for-profit schools, with an average of 70 to 90% of all funding. In fact, 26% of federal funding goes to for-profit schools, even though, again, they only make up 11% of all students. There is a federal cap on for-profit funding from the federal government. This is the 90-10 rule, meaning for-profit schools cannot exceed 90% of their funding from the government. However, as this graph shows, funding from Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense are not included in this 90% cap. This has resulted in some schools receiving nearly 100% of funding from the government, such as ITT Tech, which we can see right in the middle there. ITT Tech is now closed due to fraudulent practices. The next key player are private loan lenders. Another source of revenue for for-profit schools are private loans. Many for-profit schools actually encourage students to borrow more money if their costs are not covered by federal loans. As any for-profit institution, they must satisfy their investors and shareholders with high enrollment, growth, and of course, profits. And last, but certainly not least, every institution of higher education must share the mission of benefiting students and society as a whole. To understand the for-profit education a little bit better, let's take a look at who is attending these schools. For-profit schools have a high percentage of low-income students, first-generation students, racial minorities, and other adult and non-traditional learners. What do all these people have in common? These are all marginalized populations that face social barriers to education and are directly marketed to by for-profit schools. There are also a high portion of veterans, which is another population for-profit schools market to, which is incentivized by the Department of Defense funding. Of course, there are reasons students choose to attend these schools. They are very attractive to the populations they serve. They offer career training for in-demand occupations. They are accessible with high acceptance rates and low admission criteria. They also offer flexible programs such as online and part-time programs that are appealing to parents, those who work full-time, and those challenged by mobility. Unfortunately, the reality is bleaker. Let's take a look at some of the downsides. A for-profit education is more expensive than community colleges and public universities, with a bachelor's degree costing 20% more on average. 96% of students at for-profit schools take out loans. This is significantly higher than that of other schools, both because of the high costs and the high amount of low-income students. Furthermore, borrowing is encouraged because this then turns into revenue for the school. Furthermore, the education provided is not leading to careers that can pay off these loans. One study found that after 12 years, over half of for-profit students defaulted on their loans. Graduation rates are also much lower than public and nonprofit schools. In one study, over half of students left before obtaining their degrees. This quote is by Tressie McMillan Cottom, who studies for-profit education. She says, "The system that we've come to rely on to increase access to higher education to the most vulnerable among us really only compounds their poverty and their risk factors. That's the exact opposite of what higher education is supposed to do." Next, let's look at the current relevance of this controversy. For-profit schools continue to be a hot topic in the political sector. During the Obama administration, the Department of Education cracked down on for-profit schools, instating regulations including the rule of gainful employment and borrower defense to repayment if a school commits fraud. Currently, the Trump administration has paused both these regulatory actions, as well as a ruling that was set to go into action requiring for-profit schools to be transparent about their programs' performances. Prior to this pause in regulation, immense amounts of fraudulent practices were revealed at numerous for-profit colleges, resulting in closures and major lawsuits. ITT Tech was one of them due to predatory lending and high default rates. Another was Corinthian Colleges Incorporated, which marketed false job placement rates. Another big for-profit school that is in hot water is DeVry University, as well as Career Education. They both have lawsuits against them for fraud and outright lying to students. Furthermore, accreditation at for-profit schools are usually nationally accredited, not regionally, making it difficult for students to transfer credits to other schools. Who does this hurt, and why is this controversy important to understand as educators? Let's take a look. It doesn't just hurt students, it hurts the overall economy. With for-profit schools contributing significantly to the student debt crisis and defaulting of loans, it is impacting the housing market, new business development, and national spending. Again, these schools are targeting already vulnerable populations who, in seeking education to better their circumstances, are kept down with debt and a degree that is not competitive in the workforce. Finally, it hurts higher education as a whole, jeopardizing the integrity of institutions that are supposed to exist for the public good to improve society and the outcomes of individuals. Finally, let's take a look at some solutions for this controversy and some of my own personal views on the issue at hand. My first solution is community college. They offer a similar, if not better, education than for-profit schools. They cost significantly less, and their credits are transferable. There also needs to be better access for marginalized populations and first-generation students in our community college and public school systems. Realistically, public and community colleges cannot bear the influx of students alone at this time. Therefore, regulation needs to continue in the for-profit sector to ensure fair practices. Finally, there needs to be more education regarding personal finance and borrowing in order to equip young adults with the information they need to make smart choices. Again, the shared mission of all institutions of higher education is to better the lives of individuals and society. As a higher education professional, I am dedicated to ensuring students are receiving an education that leads them to live a more fulfilled life. Education is a great equalizer and should be available to all in a fair and just structure. Thank you so much for watching my presentation today. Here are all of my references, and I hope you learned something new.